Welcome to the Performing Arts Series brought to you by the Kennedy Center and the Prince William Network. I'm Maria Salvador, your moderator for today's program. With us is Lawrence Yep, teacher, playwright, and award-winning novelist whose prizes include 2 Newbery Honor Citations. Mr. Yep explores ideas, history, stories, and people and experiences that connect in unexpected ways, past to present, China to America, old to young. He examines what it's like to be an outsider, not belonging to the main group, and other issues that each of us confront in our own lives. We'll look at how writing has taken Mr. Yep from being what he calls a puzzle to being a puzzle solver. We'll find out how writing may help us investigate how lives connect and begin to unravel our own puzzles. Welcome, Mr. Yep.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
In the Golden Mountain series, Chronicles, you bring to life history, cultural traditions, and clashes between generations and cultures. The book spans numerous generations and 2 continents. Tell us, what is the Golden Mountain and what started your journey to them?
Well, it was a typical 60s story. I wanted to discover my roots, and I was trying to understand what would drive the Chinese over to America and risk a very dangerous voyage, because the death rate on some of those ships was as bad as it was on some of the slave ships. And then, of course, it raised another question in my mind. What happened to these men when they came to America and they found themselves, they found themselves in a society that emphasized your own personal interests over being individuals? And it's grown into 8 novels, spans 150 years of American history, covers 7 generations, and there's a 9th one to go.
Well, the story actually begins with the Serpent's Children. What inspired you to find out about a time and a place that seems so long ago and far away?
Well, you know, I realized that this problem of individual freedom didn't begin just here in America. It actually started in China, because a lot of times you can have family that will do things for you that they do out of love, and actually it isn't really what you want. And in this section from Serpent's Children, there's a young girl named Kasha, and she's just lost her mother, and her father's off fighting a war, so she's all alone with her little brother Foxfire. So her clan decides that the best thing to do for her is to make her more attractive so she can find a future husband. But at this time in China, a girl was thought to be beautiful if her feet were bound so that they were in the shape of a lotus flower. All right, so this is Cassia talking. Lily proudly crossed her legs so she could ease off a slipper. There, see how lovely my foot is? Despite all the perfume, I could smell sweaty, unwashed flesh. Auntie's palms cupped Lily's foot. It's shaped just like a flower, delicate and perfect. I drew away. It looks like a hoof. Where are your toes? Lily pointed toward the sole of her foot. They've been bent underneath, shaped the way a shrub is formed to make it beautiful. Auntie kept her grip on me. I think we'd better begin. Mind your teeth. No, I said, and struggled to get away. But for an old woman, Auntie had a remarkably strong grip. Lily called to the chair bearers and then began to pet me. We'll do this gradually, she explained gently, a little bit at a time. No, I said. Lily began to pull yards and yards of bandages from the sack the bearer had brought. And while it's going on, you won't have to do a thing. Just sit around all day eating and sleeping. No, I cried. By now the bearer was helping Auntie hold me down. It didn't seem to be my toes that Lily slowly began to curl down. My foot she began to bind. At first, it was only a vague discomfort, but as Lily began to bind my other foot, the first one began to ache. And the pain, it was my pain, from my foot. It hurts, I complained. Auntie stroked my arm. Of course it does, dear, but only a little bit. But the ache kept growing. How long? A year, maybe 2. Lily kept on winding the bandages around my second foot.
Whoa. Now, you've written from a girl's point of view, and you use different points of view in different time periods. Tell us about some of the voices you've used, How do you choose the point of view from which you write? Do you have your reader in mind when you make that decision? And what do you hope they'll come away with when reading from a particular point of view?
Well, you know, when I write, I really try and step into somebody else's shoes. So when I wrote Dragon Wings, I was trying to step into my father's shoes because I was trying to understand what it was like for him when he came over from China. But really, when I write, I really try to write for the child in myself. And I think if I do a good job, people respond. And the whole point of a point of view is, we know there's that saying, travel is broadening. When you go to another country, you see America with new eyes when you come back. And I think if I do my job as a writer, when a reader finishes my book, that reader will see his or her world with new eyes as well. And so, for example, when they walk along the street, maybe when they see an old man, suddenly they'll see a tiger wizard. They'll realize there could be a tiger wizard hiding underneath that appearance.
It's interesting. But how do you create believable emotions in these books? How do you create an authentic voice?
Well, you know, in Chinese folktales, you have ghosts that slipping in and out of people's bodies, so it's almost like Grand Central Station. And it's the same thing with doing a story. I'll slip into a character and try the body on for size, and the ones that work, I try and publish.
It's interesting. Do you choose a point of view, a different point of view, such as a girl's perspective, as in The Child of the Owl, to distance yourself, or is it easier to write about a tough topic from different points of view?
Well, really, I need a challenge as a writer. That's why every point of view is just a little bit different. If I could take you home, I could show you filing cabinets full of stories where it didn't work. But I like challenges in general, and that's why I do different genres like mysteries, fantasies, picture books, folk tales.
Well, how much of you is in your writing? You indicated in your memoir, Lost Garden, that you had difficulty when you attended Chinese language school at St. Mary's in Chinatown in San Francisco. How close was your experience to that of Casey's in Child of the Owl?
Oh, it was very close. I mean, I really was writing about my Chinese teacher and my experience. Like Casey, I grew up in an Afro-American neighborhood, and so like Casey also, when I went to school in Chinatown, I had to face what it meant to be Chinese, and you know, this description from Child of the Owl was about my Chinese school, and when she's trying to learn how to do calligraphy. The worst thing of all was Chinese school. I still get nightmares about it sometimes. I wasn't a bad student in the American school, but 1 hour out of each day, the nuns left several classes, and in would come the Chinese teachers. And right away, they put me into the dummies class, which met in an old room used to store old desks that were so ancient they had little holes with iron bottoms for putting ink bottles into. I found out quick enough that even this class was too tough for me. They taught school on the assumption that the kids already knew some Chinese, so they would explain the simple words with even simpler ones, but I didn't even know those. The teacher was a plain-faced lady whose pancake makeup peeled in little patches so it looked like she had some kind of skin disease. She wore a sleeveless silk dress that hugged her body all the way down to her knees, except for the slit that showed one leg. On Monday, the teacher stood in front of the class to read that week's lesson from this thin little paperback that was our textbook. The lesson had a colored picture of ants crawling over a rotten pomegranate, and the teacher explained the picture and story with a lot of hand gestures. Then she started to read the story out loud again slowly, accenting each word carefully and pausing after each sentence, which ended in an American-style period. Then she waved to the class to repeat the line. No one else was having trouble reading the words, but all I saw was a bunch of squiggly lines, so I took out my pencil to copy down the sounds I heard. I did that for about 5 sentences, and then I heard the teacher. "What are you doing?" She spoke as if her mouth were full of marbles when she tried to speak English. I'm trying to write down the sounds. I held up my book. See? The teacher's eyebrows came together and she pursed her lips as if she were having trouble following me and wording her own answer. That no good. You think too much American. Not think Chinese. Never learn. You erase. But how am I going to be able to read the words out loud if I don't know what they sound like? I heard the teacher tap her foot impatiently. Even if she had enough English to explain, and I wasn't sure about that, she didn't want to take the time out just for one dumb student. I didn't have to know Chinese to see that she ran her class like it was some well-oiled machine. She was so used to a certain routine that she hated to break it. You erase, she insisted. But how? You erase! She snatched the book out of my hand and hit me with it. She didn't hit me hard enough to hurt, only to shock. Then she tossed my book back on top of my desk. You American-born. Lazy, lazy, lazy. Then she folded her left arm over her stomach and, holding her book in her right hand, she began to walk back up the aisle, reading the next sentence in the lesson. I sat for a while listening to all the crazy sounds, and then I picked up my pencil and slowly began to erase what I had written, leaving the page without any meaning to me.
Casey was clearly an outsider, just like Otter is. Otter is first introduced in Dragon's Gate. He was on the outside too. Like many of your characters, they feel like outsiders even when it appears that they're on the inside. Do you see yourself mainly within one of your characters, such as Otter or Casey? And what characteristics do you, the writer, share with the people in your novels?
Well, you know, I had friends both in my own neighborhood and in Chinatown. But even then, there were times that I felt like an outsider. In my own neighborhood, if we were fighting war games, I would always have to be the all-purpose Asian that got killed. So I'd either be the Japanese who got killed during World War II, I'd be the North Korean during the Korean War. And when I would go into Chinatown and go to school, my school was a Catholic one. And so my friends in Chinatown would sometimes tell dirty jokes. But they wouldn't want the nuns to understand, so they would use Chinese. But the problem is I didn't understand Chinese either. And so I missed out on a good deal of humor when I was a kid. So even though I had friends, there were times I didn't fit in. And, but I think it's interesting, since I started publishing some of these stories, I get letters from all around the country from children who also feel like outsiders sometimes.
Well, in the passage you just read from Child of the Owl, there's a lot of detail. How do you recall that, and how does that fit into your writing? How do you remember that? And it's clear that you remember the feelings very vividly, and you convey that in your writing.
Well, you know, part of it is learning to connect to your memories. I mean, when I was describing that teacher, that's her posture. I mean, I got a little shiver in my back. I could almost see her again. And there are sometimes when you relive certain memories you don't want to relive.
Okay, so well, that raises another interesting question, because the Chronicles weren't written in the order that they present the various generations. In other words, the earlier periods, such as Serpent's Children or Dragon's Gate, were written after Dragon Wings and Child of the Owl. Why? How is it to go back and fill in the history of the family?
Well, you know, the Chinatown I knew as a kid was very small and intimate, very much like the maps that all of you have been doing. And so everybody knew one another. And so when I began writing about the Chinatown in my imagination, all my characters knew one another. And so when I did Dragon Wings, Wind Rider and Moonshadow began introducing me to other friends and family that they knew. And so that's why it's grown. And they told me about all these stories that happened before and all these stories that happened afterwards.
Well, it's interesting. Since the Chronicles follow several generations, the characters naturally age and grow. What happens to you in order for your characters to mature in a believable way?
Well, you know, I think I had to grow and mature as well. The most recent book, Traitor, couldn't have been written much earlier than now. I mean, I think now I'm old enough that I can understand that behind everyone's anger, there's often a kind of desperate sadness.
Explain that a little bit more. Go into a little more detail. I'm not sure what kind of sadness? What are you talking about?
Well, you know, sometimes there's, you can see certain people's pain that drives them along. You can understand the roots that cause them to do that. Sometimes, as in the case of this one group of American miners, they were fighting for their families. And it didn't really take a lot to drive them into this desperate explosion of anger.
And you, as a writer, had to come to the point to be able to recognize that?
Well, you know, I think, you know, at first when I began writing, I would just look at the surface of the anger and see the violence. And now I can begin to understand some of the roots that go behind that anger.
Okay. Well, Otter's 14 when he first appears in Dragon's Gate, which takes place a bit later than Serpent's Children. Tell us about Otter and his role in Dragon's Gate.
Well, Otter is Cassia's son, and he's living like a prince in China. But then he gets in trouble, and so he comes to America. And so it's a shock for him when he sees how his father and his uncle Foxfire are paying for this lifestyle back in China. And so, and the other thing is he's left the tropics in China and he's come to California up into the mountains during the worst winter of the century. And so he's literally living underneath the snow. And in this scene from Dragon's Gate, Otter begins to realize when he's trapped. What happens is there's a musician that's in the same cabin he is, and the musician is named Doggy, and Doggy has frostbite on his fingers. Bright Star handed him a chopstick. "Put this between your teeth." White-faced Doggy set the chopstick in his mouth and planted his hand down on top of his bunk. Father and Uncle Foxfire came over to hold him. No one said anything while Bright Star shifted the knife around in the stove, heating the blade. When he finally took it out, it glowed red hot. I was going to go outside, but when no one else did, I didn't want them to think I was a coward, so I stayed. But I didn't look. Even so, I don't think I'll ever forget the smell of burning flesh or the funny little crunching sound. Doggy made a muffled little scream like a toy whistle. And, you know, he returns later on in a book called The Traitor. He's grown up now with a son of his own, and he's no longer the selfish boy of Dragon's Gate, but he's very idealistic, which has gotten him into trouble in turn. And he and his son Joseph find themselves mining coal in Rock Springs, Wyoming, just before one of the worst race riots in American history.
But Traitor is written from two very different points of view. One is from Joseph, the Chinese-American boy, and the other is from an American, a white American point of view. They're very different, and
well, you know, I think, you know, we were talking about that desperate anger behind the desperate sadness behind the anger. When I first began writing the story, I just told it from Joseph's viewpoint, but I realized all we were seeing was the surface of this surface violence. And I realized that if the story was going to have its real dimensions, it was going to have to be told from the viewpoint of both a Chinese boy and an American boy. Because even at this dark moment in American history, there were certain beacons of light. There were certain Americans who defied the mob and hid Chinese. And at any rate, this is all told from the viewpoint of Michael Purdy.
okay.
He's trying to hide from bullies led by a boy named Seth, and he finds his hiding place in this cave where he meets Joseph. And so this is him describing that moment. The Chinese boy gently pried a slab of stone from the wall and held it out toward me. "Take a look." I leaned forward to look at his treasure. It looked like a clamshell, sure enough, but it gleamed bright and yellow. "Is that gold?" I asked, growing excited. "Fool's gold," he said expertly. "Iron pyrite. Over the years, the mineral takes the place of the real shell. See?" As he swept the candle back and forth, the ceiling and walls glittered off more golden shells. "I call this place Star Rock, even if it's mostly shells." They may be shells, but they shine like stars, I agreed. A whole ocean of stars. And I remembered one evening long ago when Ma and me had been hanging out a big load of wash with the help of a kerosene lantern. Suddenly lights had flashed across the sky, and I tried to get her to make a wish on one of the shooting stars. Ma had said that she had tried wishing on a whole bushel of stars, and nothing ever came of it. I just had to get one for Ma. Maybe if she had one in her hand, she'd start wishing again. Digging out my pocket knife, I started to lean toward a shell at the same time as the boy. Our heads thunk together hard. "Ow! You have a head like a rock," he complained, rubbing the sore spot. "Yours must be solid bone," I said. I began to pick at the rock with my knife. "That shell is mine," he snapped. I went on stubbornly scraping at the rock because this was for Ma. I saw it first. But I found Star Rock first. Angrily, he seized my wrist. "Get back!" He raised his hammer in warning. I pulled free, holding my knife up. "Find your own." The anger flashed inside me like a match to a fuse. Mean, ugly thoughts whirled through my head. This boy was a greedy pig. He was trying to hog all the stars for himself. And the anger just kept getting stronger and stronger until it was a howling windstorm inside me. And then it was like the trapdoor to a cellar banged open, and all these mean, hateful things hopped into my head. I realized they were the things that Ma and Mrs. Riley had said about the Chinese. I hadn't realized I'd stored it all away inside, but I had. Like some white lightning, it turned to pure poison. The rage just poured out of me. You Chinese just come storming into a place and taking whatever you like. You take the best coal rooms and steal coal. The worst of it is you take jobs that could go to Americans. There's a lot of families going hungry in town because of you. He stiffened. Our families are more than hungry. They're starving. Why do you think we put up with such miserable jobs? We work so they won't die. We were both so mad now they were panting like bellows. I hated him. I hated the Chinese. I hated that bully Seth. I hated the town. But since he was the only one there, I wanted to pound him. His face was so ugly, and the way it was all twisted now made it the ugliest I'd ever seen. I raised my fist to punch him. He looked at his hammer even higher, like he had the same notion. What right did he have to be mad? He was a thief. He was the invader. I wondered if my face was just as ugly and twisted as his. And the anger melted away like dirt under Ma's strong soap. I'd been ready to kill him, and that scared me. And the friendship that grows between Joseph and Michael just proves stronger than the hate that surrounds them. And so I like to think that the novel is as much about the power of hope as it is about friendship.
And there's that whole notion of, people being mirrors to our own emotions. And that's very powerful.
Yeah, I think it's really important to see yourself in other people.
We're changing the topic a little bit here, but you're obviously interested in traditional literature and folktales. Not only have you retold and rewritten several collections of them, you use traditional stories in your novels. Where do the stories come from? Why do you include them?
Well, I do a lot of research and I read a lot of folktales, but the reason why I do that is a myth or a legend becomes like a lens that helps me focus in on the experience.
How so?
Well, it helps me include certain elements and exclude others. So I once heard an actor talk about the roles he played. When he plays Iago, he's always trying to figure out what other people's angles are, even when he's not in character. When he plays Willie Loman in Death of a Salesman, what he sees is people's pain. And so that's a myth also acts on the same way for me. It helps me cut out certain elements and include certain other things.
So it helps direct what's important in the tale.
It helps give it structure.
Okay. Well, dragons are particularly important in Wind Rider and in Dragon Wings. Tell us about the differences in dragons from China and their counterparts from Europe and America, and their link to Wind Rider.
Well, as a child, I used to read a lot of fantasy books from the library. And so I was always puzzled by the dragons that I found in those fantasy books, because they were always mean, nasty animals. because I knew from Chinatown that dragons could actually be good creatures. And so even as a child, I was fascinated by dragons, and especially this double meaning that they had. And so it was natural when I wrote Dragon Wings to think about dragons as a natural metaphor for a character called Wind Rider. He dreams it was once a dragon, and for his sins as a dragon, he was reborn as a human. And so he's stuck. But in this dream that he has, he encounters this Dragon King. And as Wind Rider says, he was old, that dragon, but his heart was young. On the way to his kingdom, we had races, short ones, out of consideration for me. After all, I only had puny soft-skin muscles now to power my wings, while he had the muscles of a dragon's body. Sometimes we raced so low that our feet broke the surface of the water, and we plowed great white wakes behind us. And we would end the race by tracing designs in the sea. So the dream is just this wonderful experience for Wind Rider, and it's one that he would like to have again. But as I said, he's stuck as a human.
Well, Wind Rider confronts a huge personal dilemma, and that is to spend his money on dragon wings or to spend it to reunite his family. Tell us a little more about his dilemma, and what was the seed of this idea?
Well, you know, it's a dilemma that I think faces most Chinese Americans, because on the one hand, they come from a Chinese culture that emphasizes cooperation and self-sacrifice. In other words, putting the family's interest over yours. On the other hand, they're growing up in America, where the emphasis is on competition and thinking about your own individual needs. And sometimes it's not always easy to balance both sets of demands. Sometimes you have to decide to move in one direction, and that's what Wind Rider does when he decides to build his own airplane, because he wants to recapture that experience of flying.
And that's Dragon Wings.
Yes.
Now, did a Chinese really build his own?
Oh, the story is actually based on a true true Chinese American aviator, Feng Zhouguo. He built and flew his own airplane in 1909.
That's fascinating. You indicated that you never know what will spark an idea. Which personal history and your family's story seem to combine, to intersect with the history and the people and the places and the cultures in your historical novels. How do you go about doing your research? How did you come across, the information that led to Dragon Wings?
Well, a lot of it's just, I do a lot of reading in history. Some of it's serendipity. I mean, I just pull out interesting books off library shelves. I just like walking through a library and just looking for what I can find and then reading about that. But then also it's partly playing that game that every writer plays, what if? And so I asked myself, what if you took these friends and family and you put them in a different period of history? I mean, they'd still have the same, maybe independence, maybe the same toughness, maybe the same resourcefulness, but it would work itself out in different ways than the actual reality that I knew.
Well, when the circus came to town, it takes place around the same time that Dragon Wings does. However, the setting is very different, and it's very different. It's told from a very different point of view. Ursula lives with her parents in Whistle, Montana. After being permanently scarred by smallpox, she vows never to show her face in public again. But the Chinese cook, Assam, finds an amazing way to restore Ursula's confidence and break down the isolation of an individual and of a community in the middle of a frigid, frigid Montana winter.
Well, actually, it's based on some real history where a real Chinese circus came to a little town, but I retold it as fiction. And anyway, this is Ursula talking. Assam stared at me. What do you think a circus is? Big tents and big bands and lots of performers? I scratched my head. Well, isn't it? Assam shook his head. The magic doesn't come from size and flash. I knew better than that, though. There was no such thing as magic anymore. Well, where does it come from? I demanded skeptically. From inside, Assam replied and pointed. From inside something like that bench or that cup or my boot. I don't see how, I snorted. Just you wait. There'll be clowns and acrobats, Assam promised. Well, there won't be animals, I said. A circus has got to have animals. Assam winked. There'll be one anyway. I folded my arms stubbornly. Whatever show you put on, it's got to be outside my window. Don't you want to sit right in front? Assam asked in disappointment. I shook my head so hard that I almost loosened my scarf. Afraid, I held it up against my face. You know why. We'll do it then, Assam sighed. My curiosity bump, though, was the size of a mountain by now. Assam knew that. He made a point of wagging an index finger at me. No peeking, Ursula. The trick is for you. Moll put her hands on my shoulders. Ursula wouldn't spoil her own surprise. I've been thinking to do just that. I started to blush behind the scarf. I felt like I was in a furnace.
Is there a real Whistle, Montana?
No, actually it was a little town called Trumbull, Montana, and it's all gone now. It was named Trumbull because of the aspen trees where the leaves used to tremble.
Oh, interesting. Well, you've said that writing has taken you from being a puzzle to being a puzzle solver. How? What did you mean by that?
Well, you know, as a child, I knew my Afro-American neighborhood, and I went to every day to Chinatown. And in both areas, I could see that people had things in common. The pieces might seem different, and yet they fit into the similar patterns. And, you know, I've been meeting with students all this week, and I can see them making the same kind of links, not only between different areas, but also between the past and the present. Now, I had a wonderful time reading all your writing and looking at all your maps. And unfortunately, I can't talk about all of them, but you know, I liked reading Joshua's piece because his grandmother liked eating at economical Chinese restaurants, and that was a lot like my grandmother. My grandmother never ate at a restaurant with a tablecloth because she said they were wasting money in decor. Then there was a young lady called Emily. She wrote about her mother being late. When my mother was a little girl, she was the same way. She grew up in West Virginia, and actually I've written 2 books about it, Starfisher and Dream So. And my mother was always having to take the shortcut across this field, but this farmer hated that. And so one winter he put this bull in the pasture, and my mother didn't realize it until she was halfway through. And so it was this real nightmare of having to high step through this very deep snow with this bull chasing her and snorting behind her. And then there was Shannon. She talked about how her mother got into trouble for going onto a beach that belonged to rich people. My mother used to get into the same kind of trouble in West Virginia. During the winter, the boys were allowed to belly flop on sleds, but girls were supposed to go down sitting up with their hands over their laps so their skirts wouldn't go up. But of course, my mother and my aunts were kind of like tomboys, so they'd belly flop and get into trouble if they ever were caught. Brianna talked about how much fun her mother and grandmother had in hard times. My grandmother and her children were the same way. I mean, you know, as that saying goes, they knew they didn't have a lot of money, but they didn't know they were poor.
Well, based on an activity suggested by Mr. Yep, several classes have actually mapped their own neighborhoods and those of an older person they know. We think that they've discovered some intersections that may inspire or may have inspired their own writing. We have some of the students with us today who did the activity, and we'll hear from them now. Okay,
This is a map that our group did, and we made our own.
We need you. Let's get the microphone so everybody can hear you. Okay, very good. All right.
We did our own maps first, and then
Hold it up a little higher. There
Then
you
we
go.
got into groups.
Start again.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, we mapped out our neighborhoods. First, our teacher told us to make our own maps of our own way to school. And then we got into groups and we put our maps together.
So you built a whole community. That's
Yes.
neat. And did you have an opportunity to map somebody else's neighborhood, an older person in your life, maybe?
No, but we did interview them and write a story.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Go ahead, Larry.
Well, I was just wondering, in your interviews, when you interviewed some of the older people, was there anything that really surprised you as you did the interview?
My grandmother had to walk 4 miles to school.
Why did that surprise you?
Because I never knew of anybody having to walk that far to school.
Interesting. How do you get to school?
My mom takes me.
All right. So different time and different generation.
Yes.
That's interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Now it's the audience's turn to ask a few questions. For our viewers, the phone number is 1-800-578-1396. Let us hear from you. And while we're waiting for calls, let's take a question from our studio audience from Ripon and Graham Park Middle Schools in Prince William County, Virginia. Do we have a question? Okay.
How was your life when you were younger?
How was my life?
How was your life when you were younger?
Well, my parents had a grocery store, and so my father worked 18 hours a day, and I was expected to work several hours a day as well as do all my homework. And so whenever I start getting tired at the computer after, say, the 3rd or 4th hour, I just remind myself of how hard my father used to work. That always gets an extra hour of writing out of me.
You have another question?
What advice would you give anyone who wants to write?
I would advise anyone who wants to write to always write about what you know. The fact is, though, that you probably know more than you think, because good writing brings out the specialness of ordinary things. And all you really need to do is look at something very closely and then write about it from a slightly different angle.
It's the detail.
Mm-hmm. When will I be making my next book? In fact, I was working on it this morning. I'm working on a new fantasy series about a tiger and his reluctant apprentice.
How long does it take you to write your typical novel? I mean, what is the process, and what does your day look like?
Well, actually, I write about 4 hours every morning, and then I spend about another 4 hours answering letters and doing some research, and I work about 6 to 7 days a week. That's what happens when you're self-employed. A book can vary depending on the needs of the publisher. I did a Star Trek novel. It was 400 pages that I did in 3 months. When I wrote Dragon's Gate, that took 20 years because the research was that hard.
We have a call. I mean, we have a.
What is your secret when writing?
What is my secret when writing? Part of it is I actually just, it's using a lot of sense details. If you want vivid writing, you put in some of the other senses, like the sense of smell, the sense of hearing. I wish we had time to do some of those exercises that I used to do with my own writing classes.
Okay. Well, we have a call from Tri-Valley, New York. Go ahead, caller. I thought we had a call from Tri-Valley, New York. Shall we go ahead with another studio? Okay. Go ahead, caller. We can't hear it. Can we go ahead? Okay. Who in the audience has another question while we're trying to connect with Tri-Valley, New York? Okay. Well, when, okay. Now, you talked about the senses, and how does that fit into writing? What kind of exercises would you do with writing students that maybe prospective writers could use themselves? What would you encourage them to do?
Well, it actually begins with something as simple as actually just closing your eyes for maybe a minute or two, because our brains are devoted mostly to interpreting things from our eyes. When you close your eyes for a minute or two, but you have to explain to your teacher what you're doing ahead of time so she doesn't think you're napping. What happens then is that the brain is so starved for information. When you open up your eyes again, there's just this wealth of information coming into your mind, and you start noticing things you wouldn't have noticed before, like maybe the light on your desk, maybe you know, a certain wart on your hand. You just never know what you'll see.
Interesting. What was your training? What was your professional training as a writer? What qualified you as a writer? What made you want to write and keeps you writing?
Well, you know, I had an English teacher that in high school who told me if I wanted to get something, if I wanted to get an A-list course, I had to get something accepted by a national magazine. And I started sending out stories and got rejection letters. And he retracted the threat, but then that overcame my fear of sending out stories.
Okay. Well, apparently we do have a call from New York. Go ahead, caller.
I was wondering what Lawrence Yep's favorite book he wrote was.
What's your favorite book, Lawrence Yep?
You know, that's a fair question. I get asked that a lot. But that's like asking your mother who her favorite child is. Every book has special meaning to me. So I don't mean to be evasive, but I really can't answer that.
Well, do you feel closer to one character, perhaps, than another?
No, because that's like asking me which family, because all my books are based on family members and friends. So that could start a feud in the family if I say I'm closer to one character or another.
Okay. Well, you know, in cold, a lot of your novels are really cold. Mm-hmm. In the Golden Mountain Chronicles, you know, Dragon's Gate, you freeze to death, just like we heard Doggy lost fingers to frostbite. Ursula experiences a really cold winter in Montana. Why does cold seem so real in your novels?
Well, I went to graduate school in Buffalo, and when I was there, I was wading through snow up to my waist, and everyone was telling me how mild the winter was, and I thought they were putting me on. But when I left, they really did have a bad winter, and the animals actually escaped from the zoo because the snow piled up over the fence.
So they could actually climb?
Yeah, they actually climbed over the fence. And so anytime I want to think about being cold, I think about Buffalo.
That's some real snow. We now have a call from Dumfries, Virginia. Go ahead, caller.
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Yep. But first of all, I'd like to let you know that my daughter is supposed to be there. Her name is Belinda Miller. She's out sick, so she really missed being there. My question is, how old were you when you started writing?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry Belinda's not here. So, I was 18. I was 17 actually in high school, and I sold my first story when I was 18 to a science fiction magazine. I sold it for a penny a word, which is what Charles Dickens was getting in the 1840s, except pennies went a lot further then.
We have an audience question now. Go ahead.
Do you ever get writer's block, and how do you deal with it?
Do you ever get writer's block?
Yeah. You know, actually what happens is I work on several projects at the same time. I work on one story, and then actually the phrase that Mark Twain used is that when the tank runs dry, then you switch over to another story. And so that's what I do. But often the stories are related by theme. And so when I was working on a fantasy series about a dragon and her pet boy, when I started running out of steam on that, I would switch over to a mystery novel about Mark Twain and a sidekick. And so they were actually both related to they were both variations on a theme. I mean, I like to think in terms of music when I write. And actually, I listen to a lot of music when I write. The Mark Twain book actually got written to a rock group called the B-52s. You'd probably have to listen to classic rock now to hear them.
I'll be darned. Is there a difference in writing different types of books? Is it different writing a mystery, for example, from one of the historical novels?
Well, you know, the genre presents different issues, and there's a different structure. But that's part of the fun of it. I mean, it's like being a musician, and when you have to play in one genre, then you have to play in another. And they have different rewards.
Okay. We have another phone call? Or do we have a studio audience call? Never Sink. Never Sink. Go ahead, caller.
Yes. How long did it take Mr. Yep to write each book?
How long did it take me to write each book? It varies. I could do a Star Trek book in 400 pages in 3 months, but Dragon's Gate took about 20 years because the research was so hard. I mean, it was like I asked you to build a house out of toothpicks, but before I let you do that, I took the toothpicks and I scattered them all over a building. And so you had to go around picking up one toothpick at a time.
Interesting. We have another audience question. Go ahead.
Who is your favorite author, and what did he do that inspired you to write books?
Well, you know, I actually have 2 favorite authors. One of them was a science fiction writer called Robert Heinlein. You know, they did a movie out of one of his novels, Starship Trooper. I don't know if anyone here has seen it. But he's an amazing writer. In just 3 paragraphs, he could make a character come to life and make you want to have this adventure with that writer. And so that's actually how I learned to do first-person narratives. But then from another science fiction writer called Andre Norton, I learned how to write about other worlds and other places. And she would also write about worlds that were changing. I mean, the world was one world. The time period for this world was coming to an end. The civilization was coming to an end, and it was a time of transition. And I think that called to me especially as a Chinese American, because there are so many times when you feel like you're balanced between 2 different time periods, 2 different cultures.
Interesting. We have another question here. Go ahead.
You mentioned that you write about people you know. Have you ever made anybody upset?
Yes, I actually made, when I did my autobiography, well, first of all, I should say, none of my friends and family have ever objected to being in any of my fiction. When I did my autobiography, well, first of all, my mother wants to see her own sections. When she was a girl, she was 5'2". In the Chinatown of that period, that actually made her the basketball center on her basketball team. And so she wanted that put in. My brother, though, was the most nervous. He was especially nervous about anything I was going to write about him. And so I actually had to let him look at his sections. And when he read them, he gave me his okay. But then my sister-in-law got mad at me because she said I took it too easy on him.
Interesting. What was your relationship like with your brother when you were growing up?
Well, my brother was 10 years older than I was. And my parents had actually read, my parents were afraid that he'd be jealous of me. And so they read that get the older child involved with the baby. And it only came out many years later that he deliberately chose a spelling, so they let him name me. And it only came out many years later that he deliberately chose a spelling that he knew most people would misspell. He spelled Lawrence L-A-U, and he knew most Americans would spell it L-A-W. And in fact, some of my books have been misspelled by my publishers, and those are always his favorite books.
That's funny. We have another question in the studio audience. Go ahead.
Tell us about the editing process and how do you edit your books?
Well, the editing actually is quite complicated, partly because I always show my stories to my wife first. My wife is a writer, Joanne Ryder, but she's my safety net. And so, for instance, when I wrote Dragon's Gate, I showed it to her and I thought it was publishable. And she said it could be published, but it wasn't up to my usual standards. So she made me spend another year on rewriting it. Once I do a book, then it goes into a publisher. The editor actually looks at it once. I do a set of revisions. Then it goes to a copy editor. And if I could take you home, I could show you what a copy editor does to my manuscripts. It's worse than anything a teacher ever does to your stories. There are queries and questions all over the place. And I always feel like I have to answer to them. So at any rate, it's a long process, and there's actually a lot of stages before a book actually becomes a hard copy that's in the bookstore.
How long does it take?
It can be a year. With a picture book, though, can take even longer because there's artwork that has to be done.
Okay. How many revisions do you go through
I do
before you give it to anybody else to read?
Oh yeah, it has to go through at least 7 revisions before I think it's ready. Because even though when you read my books, they sound very casual and conversational, very easy to read, that's only the result of a lot of polishing.
It's interesting. We have another studio audience question. Go ahead.
What was the most surprising thing you found during your research?
Well, I think it was with Dragon's Gate. I was surprised when I read that the Chinese had actually gone on strike and had demanded better working hours. And what they had demanded was a 40-hour week. And so it took me a while before I could track down the sources, and I wound up finding the newspaper accounts that was based on. And I found them in Reno, Nevada, in a historical museum. And it was the actual newspapers, but the newspapers were so brittle, I had to put on gloves and actually copy it out by hand in pencil, just like a medieval monk.
We now have a call from Granville, New York. Go ahead, caller.
Hi. I just wanted to ask if Mr. Yap was ever treated differently since he's Chinese and he lives in an African-American community.
Well, actually, what happened is we actually lived in the neighborhood, and we'd actually lived there than most of our neighbors, so they actually protected us. The only time we ever had trouble was when there were a gang of kids that might come in from outside the neighborhood. But it was a fairly tough neighborhood. All the other grocers had bars, iron bars, and plywood on their windows. And the neighborhood was so tough that thieves would steal trucks, and then they would back it right through the windows of these other grocers and then go in and steal what they wanted. But that actually never happened to us.
Tell us a little bit about your father's name, his American name and his Chinese name, and what your family was called in that community. Well,
in Chinatown, my father was always known as Gim, because that was his Chinese name. But in his American name was Thomas. And in our neighborhood, he was called Big Tom. My mom was called Mrs. Tom, even though that wasn't her name. My brother was called Little Tom, and my nickname in our neighborhood was Baby Tom for many years.
Wow. We have another studio audience question. Go ahead.
Have you ever disagreed with a publisher or editor over a story, and how did you handle that?
Well, you know, I always feel that with a story that I have to come up with a good reason why I don't want to make a change. And if I can, then usually the publisher backs off. But if I can't come up with a good reason, then usually they're right. And so, but the real problem came when I did my autobiography, because I didn't put enough of material, on my wife, and so that became a whole point of discussion between my wife, the editor, and me.
Interesting. How would you have changed it?
Well, I only gave her 1 paragraph, and she wanted more.
Oh, okay.
And
well,
so, and she did deserve more, because she puts up with a lot, I have to say.
Well, tell us about how you met and what her role in your writing career was.
Well, she was actually the editor of the literary magazine at Marquette University. We met in Milwaukee, and I actually became her art editor. And we were just friends for many years. But then she became an editor in the children's book department at Harper and Row. And by that time, I was doing adult science fiction. So she asked me to write science fiction for children. And so my first children's book was actually a science fiction book.
That's fascinating. Do we have another question from our studio audience? Go ahead.
If you're not a writer, what else would you like to do for a career?
It's hard for me to think of anything else. I enjoy doing what I'm doing. And my wife and I have often played that game of what would you do if you won $10 million in the lottery? And actually our day wouldn't change at all. We would still write. We might not worry about publishing as much, though. But we enjoy writing, and it's what we enjoy doing. However, my wife is a nature poet. And so when I'm at my computer for like the 3rd or 4th hour she'll poke her head in and say she's going down to the beach to work now.
Interesting. So you've never collaborated with her, have you?
We've tried, but it hasn't always quite worked out.
Okay.
It's hard to come to a point where one is willing to say, well, the manuscript's finished and I agree with you. And so
interesting.
We're both very fussy, so that's the other side of it.
And you work at different times of the day, I understand.
Well, yes, I'm very much a morning person. My wife likes to work in the evening, and so we always have one rule. We always get together for one meal, and usually it's lunch.
Okay. Well, we're just about out of time, so thank you for being with us today, and thank you, Mr. Yep. We hope that all of you continue to read and write. As Mr. Yep says, it may be something as simple yet as indestructible as a weed that links us to our past and binds us to our dreams. Seed, cast into strange soil, may thrive and grow just as children and just like your memories. I'd also like to thank the students in the studio for being with us, and also a special thanks to the viewing audience from across the country for tuning into the program. It has been my pleasure to share with you the extraordinary writings of Lawrence Yep. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question today, you may contact Mr. Yep by going to the website address on the screen and ask an additional question or two for 2 weeks. We'd love to hear from you and answer your questions. At this site, you'll also find additional information on Lawrence Yep, his books and classroom activities that integrate the arts into the curriculum. There's also information on our upcoming programs. We would also like to hear from you about what you think of the Kennedy Center Performing Arts Series. So we've provided an electronic evaluation form. It is on the Prince William Network website at www.pwnet.org. And we're asking you to fill out the form so that we can select topics and resources that you need to enhance your classroom experience. On Thursday, December the 12th, at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll rebroadcast by popular demand Connections, Science and Music, a program produced last year. Our next live performance will be Friday, February 14th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Billy Taylor will present Jazz and the New Generation, where we'll hear and talk with tomorrow's stars of jazz. Thank you for being with us.